The name of this video is called Glenn Greenwald Discusses the Importance of Independent Journalism in the Online Age. Now, this is on a channel called FUTO. So definitely check that out. But I want you to hear what he says about, again, he's going to make the connection between media and war and independent media. And let's see if you can make the connection between what Chris was talking about and what he's talking about. So, all right, here we go.
What, in a kind of very cringe way, in retrospect, was called the blogosphere, because it had influenced me first. I was a reader of it and a consumer of it before becoming a participant in it. And it was incredibly valuable because at the time, in those early 2000s, there was a kind of repression that grew out of the 9/11 attack that naturally arises whenever a country feels besieged by a foreign enemy. And there was less dissent in mainstream media discourse permitted. Obviously, that was one of the major reasons the Iraq War was allowed to happen based on false pretenses, was because there was very little questioning of the government's claims and
Okay, so again, here he is. So he's bringing up the war in Iraq. And like he said, back then, there was very little questioning. Again, you guys, like, for those of you who weren't around then, or you may have been really young at that time and didn't understand what was going on, there just weren't many people offering some type of alternative message. And so when you read these things, when I watched the news, I mean, it was easier to believe it and not question it, right? Someone said, look at the computer behind him. Yeah, I did notice that when I first saw this clip. I don't know. Yeah, that's from like back in the day. All right, let's go back in.
And propaganda. And so this kind of independent sector of what became the media, which was people who weren't media professionals, hadn't gone to Columbia journalism school, had never worked at the New York Times, instead were just kind of informed citizens who had very well-developed critiques and often very virulent critiques of mainstream media institutions, were able to reach first on their own a kind of large audience because there were so many other people similarly disenchanted, and there was no intervention on the part of Google or other big tech companies. Quite the contrary, as you said, the intention at the time was to develop tools to enable people to communicate with one another without the interference by the government or by large corporations. And that was the model that grew out of Silicon Valley. I think it was kind of a libertarian ideology that drove it in the beginning, and it succeeded. It's what reached me and ultimately began changing my thinking about how I understood the world, and then motivated me to go one day very spontaneously with no plan and just click create blog on what was Google's platform called Blogspot, free platform. And
so one thing he mentioned here, I'm sorry, I missed that part, but I do want to play this where he said about intervention. Listen to this.
Well-developed critiques and often very virulent critiques of mainstream media institutions were able to reach first on their own a kind of large audience because there were so many other people similarly disenchanted, and there was no intervention on the part of Google or other big tech companies. Quite the contrary, as you said, the intention at the time was to develop tools to enable people to communicate with one another without the interference by the government or by large corporations. And
okay, that piece right there, the goal at the time was to create another source of media that would not have that interference from the United States government, or notice he also said, or from corporations. That was the intent. That was the goal, right? Because he knew, like, even back then, he obviously knew that mainstream media was heavily influenced by the US government and the talking points from the State Department. So that was the goal. Now, obviously back then, did they necessarily know that, like the Mark Zuckerberg story I talked about on Friday, did they know at the time when they created these platforms and they created other alternatives that some way or another, the US government would still find their way of getting in there and trying to disrupt shit? Probably not. But, you know, things were different back then.
that was the model that grew out of Silicon Valley. I think it was kind of a libertarian ideology that drove it in the beginning, and it succeeded. It's what reached me and ultimately began changing my thinking about how I understood the world, and then motivated me to go one day very spontaneously with no plan and just click create blog on what was Google's platform called Blogspot, free platform. And you just created a blog, and if you were writing things that people were interested in, you were able to find an audience, in part because other bloggers would promote your work, but also because Google itself would do so. And there were a lot of times I would write about something, and if I Googled that topic, maybe the first result would be the New York Times, and the second would be NBC News, and the third or the fourth would be mine.
And then the algorithm changed. So Glenn just said that back then, during that time, Google would also promote his work. That don't really happen anymore. Like, Google would promote his work. So he said you might see a CNN, there was a topic you would search, you might see CNN, you might see MSNBC, and then you would see Glenn Greenwald's work. This is how the algorithm has changed. Because now if I search for a topic in Google, if I really want to look for someone that's independent media, I have to put in their name behind it. Otherwise, it just does not come up for me. It's just all mainstream media. Interesting, huh? See how things change? See how they change the algorithm? Thank you for the reminder, Eric. I need to take some tips from CJ because I'm horrible at this. But you guys, please go ahead and hit the like button. I always forget to. I'm terrible with it. Hit the like button. That helps me with the algorithm, guys. I see we have over 600 people watching. I don't know how many likes there are. I'm looking at StreamYard, but let's go ahead and get those likes up there for me. Thank you so much. So the algorithm changed, and it makes it more difficult for people to find independent media, and that was on purpose.
And it was a very egalitarian playing field that enabled me to find a large audience despite having the backing of no media corporation. That's one of the reasons I value that freedom so much.
Yeah, right. I mean, I remember in 2004, 2003, Yahoo was just incredibly focused on the fact that Google was eating our lunch for search. So
hold on, is that a Commodore? That is a Commodore. Holy crap. Do you guys see this in the background? That's a Commodore in the... Oh my God. Sorry, let's get back to the story.
Both companies, we had capitalism working the way it was supposed to. We had two companies, we had a couple others too, that were fiercely competing. And the only job they saw was to connect people doing searches with relevant content. That's all they wanted to do.
I think that the ethos of the internet, and I remember going, back to the mid 90s, which is the first time I encountered the internet. I began using these political debate forums inside of these walled off communities of CompuServe and AOL that were thriving and stimulating because they were different, precisely because their anonymity allowed a kind of greater mental freedom, that you knew the things you were writing weren't connected on your permanent record to your name. And it enabled people to express themselves with a kind of greater amount of just freedom and individuality. I think when people know that they're being monitored, and there's psychological studies that demonstrate this, it's the reason I regard the right of privacy as so important. Their behavior becomes much more conformist, becomes the byproduct of societal expectations and orthodoxies rather than autonomy and agency. And it's always in the realm of privacy, when you can say things and do things without, the judgmental eyes of other people being cast upon you. That's where dissent and creativity and individuality flourishes, really where it exclusively resides. And that was the ethos of the internet at the beginning. And even
I just want to jump in and say, in reference to the creativity and censorship, when they, I'll say more so YouTube, when they ramp up censorship, it stifles creativity. I can just tell you that from my own experience here. It really does. There are so many other things that I would do, like with my show, but I can't because of the censorship. There are so many other things that I would add that would make it even more entertaining, but I can't because of the censorship. And it's a buzzkill sometimes. Like it sucks because I'm limited in what I can do creatively, and that can be really frustrating. And I'm not talking about Nothing, never mind. I'll go back into the video. I'm not talking about the type of entertainment some of you are thinking. Let's just go in here.
And once these large corporations like Google and Yahoo started to develop it and exploit it, there was still no sense that they were doing so with the intention of allowing it to be controlled, let alone censored. It was to empower and liberate. And that was the early model.
Right. I mean, that's exactly what we wanted. So you wound up working with more traditional journalism for a bit, right? And then you wound up, now today you're on primarily on Substack, right?
Yeah, it's kind of come full circle.
Has it come full circle? Like, is Substack for you, is it as free as it was back in 15 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. When I was blogging, I started finding a way to make a living, which is simply by relying once a year on the donations of readers who were donating based on the idea that they wanted me to be able to continue to do that work and not have to go work for large media corporations. And then because I had a large audience and that became the currency in the digital age of media companies, they knew they needed individuals with large followings to bring their audience to those sites, because it started to become very much based on a traffic model rather than just relying on traditional advertiser relationships. I always conditioned my willingness to go work for them, first at Salon and then The Guardian. Into my contract was written the explicit right that I had, which is very unusual, almost unprecedented actually, that I would be able to publish directly to the internet without editorial interference unless I requested it.
That's one of the things that I did notice. Like, for those who don't know, if you're new here, I actually majored in broadcast journalism in undergrad, broadcast journalism in English. I didn't end up finding a job in broadcast journalism that would actually pay me enough at the time to pay like my rent, and that's important. So that's how I ended up in education. But I actually majored in broadcast journalism. And one of the things I did know when I was doing internships, when you're working for a corporation, whether it's, I don't know, a radio station or a local TV news, whichever, you really don't have as much say-so as you think that you would. By the time the editors get a hold of your story, whether it was something that you wrote, whether it was news that you reported out in the field, a lot of times I was out in the field, whether it was that type of job per se, even as like an intern, by the time they got a hold of your work, it wasn't even what you created anymore. They would just remove so much of it that it didn't feel like it was even you anymore. And I've seen this multiple times. There are multiple times where I interviewed people and they would actually cut out the stories. And I hate to say this, but back then it was called the village idiot. I don't know if people still use that term, but they would cut out the stories of the people that we would interview that, I don't know, technically were, whatever you want to call it, like educated or whatever. They would cut out those people and they would they would put in the interviews of the people that they could make fun of. And they used to call it the village idiot. And I remember like saying to myself, like, well, no, I'm not going to get video footage of someone or interview someone who's walking around with the kid, and the kid like obviously is going through something. They maybe not have shoes on or something. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that. They would keep that in and they would take out the stories that, it didn't make any sense to me. They wanted people to appear to be like a stereotype. Whenever I interviewed Black people, it's like they would remove the Black interviews where people, like it was someone just getting off from work. And like, let's say they had on a suit or they had on business casual. That what we're calling it these days. They were dressed like business casually. They wouldn't keep those in. But they would want us to go out and interview Black people that didn't have shoes on, that were like missing teeth. And not just Black people, like whenever they sent us to like certain areas that they would call like impoverished areas, they wanted us to get the people that looked like that. And I'm like, that's not funny. So I don't know. When you go and you work for them, and people who have done this before and they now do independent media, they can tell you about it as well. Like you're censored by them too. Like by the time they edit your material, it's not even what you intended it to be anymore. And that's why some people go over to independent media. It's just the reality.
So for me, and then when I obviously left The Guardian to start The Intercept and create it, I didn't do it in order to impose more restrictions on myself. I did it to preserve that freedom, not just for myself, but for other people. So in each of those contracts was written that freedom. So I always had the same kind of full editorial autonomy and journalistic independence that I had going all the way back to that little blog of mine. But the problem became that the more you attach yourself to an institution and become the spokesperson for it, or you become dependent on a particular political faction, the more this kind of censorship and repression starts to seep into your brain in a kind of subliminal way. You may not even be aware of the ways in which you're being constrained. And it was only once I left The Intercept and returned to a fully independent model, which is Substack, where it's a very similar model to what I was relying on in 2005, in the sense that I rely on, it's not now donations, it's subscriptions, but it's the same thing. It's my readership willingly paying for my work, and they're essentially the only boss I have. It's where most of my income comes from, and it will work and is working only to the extent that Substack and its founders and managers remain committed to this model of refusing to capitulate to societal pressure, and especially from liberal establishments that they deplatform people deemed unsuitable to be heard. And so far, Substack has been impressively defiant in doing so. But Substack still hasn't quite grown into the magnitude of a media player that they need to in order for us to really know how committed they are to resisting that.
Yeah, I will say I have been, advertising Substack more. I have been telling like my friends and former students of mine about Substack. A lot of people still don't know about it. I'm surprised. I'm like, there's all these great voices on Substack, but it still hasn't really reached the masses, so to speak. So that is something I would like for you guys to share it with your friends and stuff, to let them know. Like when I read these like Substack articles on here, tell your friends, like, you guys need to get on Substack if you want to hear like great voices that you're not going to be able to hear necessarily on mainstream media. So that is something I do wish like it was out there more. I'm not going to play the entire interview, but again, the name of this interview is called Glenn Greenwald Discusses the Importance of Independent Journalism in the Online Age. And this interview took place this month, and it's on FUTO is the name of the channel there. So